The number of human beings killed as a direct or indirect result of World War II is staggering. Honestly, my jaw drops every time I read into it, and I can't help but take a step back and contemplate how those figures are far, far more than just that. Every one of them represents a human being, someone's daughter, someone's son. Military persons, of course, make up a portion of these figures, and in this series, we're going to look not only into military deaths, but at some of the most catastrophic military casualties, which we'll define as including deaths, injuries, illnesses, captures, and even desertions. We'll be looking through a fairly broad scope, considering freakish casualties to military units on the scale of formations to commandos, while keeping that scope pointed at identifiable military operations rather than attempting to encompass the war as a whole. It's also important to note that it's pretty much impossible to calculate casualties with precision, and the actual military casualties may be far less or far more than the figures gathered for this series. In this second entry to the series, our scope still encompasses the Asia-Pacific War and all of the operations therein. The Battle of Saipan began just after the start of Operation Overlord. The US opened with a bombardment from the sea on the 13th of June 1944, then deposited Marine and Army divisions on the island's beaches on the 15th and the 16th. Savage fighting took place on the shore, and then the Japanese retreated inland, using terrain to their advantage. The battle stretched out, as it so often did against the Japanese, though the Americans eventually pushed their enemy into the northern part of the island, where Japanese command accepted defeat and ordered suicidal Banzai Charges. The charges inflicted heavy casualties on the Americans, though they were suicidal, and America came out on top. The loss of Saipan was the beginning of the end for Japan in World War II, as it put American bombers in range of the Japanese home islands. US forces were made up of the 5th Amphibious Corps and the 5th Fleet and weighed in at about 71,000. Lieutenant General Saito Yoshitsugu commanded the Japanese 43rd Infantry Division and the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, as well as a mixed bag of other regiments and battalions. These combined to a force of about 32,000. The belligerents fought on beaches, swamps, jungles, cliffs, mountains, caves, sugarcane fields, and room to room in towns, and often in the night. Like on Iwo Jima, machine guns, mortars, and flamethrowers saw heavy use, and hand-to-hand combat was inevitable. US First Lieutenant John C. Chapin describes the scene on the landing beach. "All around us was the chaotic debris of bitter combat. Jap and Marine bodies lying in mangled and grotesque positions. Blasted and burnt out pillboxes, the burning wrecks of LVTs that had been knocked out by Jap high velocity fire, the acrid smell of high explosives, the shattered trees, and the churned up sand littered with discarded equipment." On the 25th of June 1944, Harold G. Epperson threw his body on top of a grenade to save his squad. For his sacrifice, a Medal of Honor was presented to his mother in his hometown, with 8,500 people from the town attending the presentation. Accepting defeat, and just before he cut out his guts, Lieutenant General Saito Yoshitsugu ordered the infamous Banzai Charge and said there is no longer any distinction between civilians and troops. It would be better for them to join in the attack with bamboo spears than be captured. Coupled with the propaganda that basically said it was better to die than to be captured by the Americans, Saito inspired many to take their own lives. Guy Galbadon, the famous US Marine who captured and saved more than 1,000 Japanese during the battle, recalled what he saw. "Many Japs, both military and civilians, committed suicide. It was sad to see children struggling with their parents, pleading not to be thrown off cliffs. Please, Father, do not kill me. I do not want to die." These parents were dangerous, desperate people who wanted nothing more than to kill the American savages who they thought would roast and eat their children. While this was a costly victory for the Americans, most of the Japanese 43rd Infantry Division the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, and other Japanese regiments and battalion defending Iwo Jima were killed or killed themselves. Of 29,000 Japanese deaths, 5,000 of them were suicides, and that number only includes military suicides. After the Japanese inflicted 145,000 casualties on the Allies in the Malayan Campaign, they first bombarded Singapore, then, in February 1942, over the Straits of Johor, invaded it. Having deceived the commander of the Allied forces in Singapore and gained a foothold on the island, the Japanese closed in, driving the inexperienced, though more numerous, defenders back, cutting their water supply and bombing the city. Feeling the heat, Allied command ordered a surrender, despite the desperate opposition of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who said, "There must, at this stage, be no thought of saving the troops or sparing the population. The battle must be fought to the bitter end at all costs. Commanders and senior officers should die with their troops. The honour of the British Empire and of the British Army is at stake." Lieutenant General Arthur Percival commanded around 85,000 inexperienced and/or ill-equipped infantrymen. This command, the Malaya Command, included the Indian 3rd Corps, the Australian 8th Division, the British 18th Division, the Malay Regiment, the SSVF, and DAL Force. In the other corner, General Tomoyuki Yamashita commanded the Japanese 25th Army, which was more than 30,000 strong and made up of the Imperial Guard Division, the 5th Infantry Division, the 18th Infantry Division, and the 3rd Air Division, as well as a light tank brigade. Singapore suffered greatly under Japanese rule, which lasted 3.5 years, with many British and Australian troops being locked up in Changi Prison. Others were shipped overseas and put into forced labour. Many perished on the hell ships on the way over. Others were bayoneted, beaten to death, or doused in fuel and burnt alive as they surrendered. Various Australian POWs in Singapore's Changi prison speak of something funny that happened there. On the Japanese Emperor's birthday, Aussie POWs were made to line up with their mugs, and along came a Jap officer resplendent with gold braid and campaign ribbons, sword swinging by his side, and he stepped up onto a raised platform specially placed in front of the parade so that he could address us at eye level. "Today is the Emperor of Japan's birthday, and we are to celebrate." Their mugs were then filled with sake, and then stepped out Vern Ray, a Rugg's 15th Battery Intelligence Officer hailing from the Torcedda country of Tasmania. In his big, booming voice, he thundered out, "Boys, we will drink to the Emperor. F*** the Emperor." A great roar went up from the Australians. The Emperor, f*** the Emperor, and the Australians quaffed down their half-filled pannikins of sake. The Japanese officer dutifully completed his toast. F*** the Emperor. Almost 85,000 Allied personnel from the Malaya Command were captured, and about 5,000 were wounded or killed, while Japanese casualties totaled 5,000. The fall of Singapore devastated Churchill. He called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. In March 1945, the US were preparing to capture Okinawa. The island was the last major stepping stone to the Japanese home islands, and the Japanese dug into it like they did on the island of Iwo Jima. On the 25th of March, the US Navy bombarded it in preparation for landing, though, like in Iwo Jima, these strikes were not enough to collapse Japanese tunnels and bunkers. Landing on the beach, the Americans split north and south, taking Japanese air bases and outposts, while off the coast, the Yamato and 9 smaller Japanese warships were put under the waves by US aircraft. Back on land, the Yanks that went north pushed the Japanese into a corner and pacified the side of the island, while those that went south encountered heavy resistance. Between the 6th of April and the 22nd of June, almost 1,900 Japanese kamikaze aircraft bore down on the US Navy off Okinawa, killing and wounding many sailors. To take the island, the Americans combined the units of the US Army with the units of the Marine Corps under the 10th Army, and this new army was supported by the 5th Fleet. This gave the Americans the numbers, with the 10th Army sitting around 180,000 and naval forces at around 18,000. The 32nd Army, around 9,000 troops from the Imperial Japanese Navy, and around 24,000 local Ryukyuan people drafted into a militia, made up the Japanese garrison in Okinawa. This combined force of around 100,000 fell under the command of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. The belligerents fought on elevated, rocky terrain and in and out of caves, pillboxes, bunkers, and machine gun and mortar death traps. When the monsoons came, they turned the battle into a soupy graveyard. Bodies rotted in the mud, and maggots crawled out of flesh and earth as if from hell itself. US veteran Eugene Sledge recalled the environment, stating, "If a US Marine slipped and slid down the back slope of the muddy ridge, he was apt to reach the bottom vomiting. I saw more than one man lose his footing and slip and slide all the way to the bottom, only to stand up horror-stricken as he watched in disbelief while fat maggots tumbled out of his muddy dungaree pockets, cartridge belt, legging lacings, and the like." Desmond Doss, born in Virginia to a homemaker and shoe factory worker and raised a Seventh-day Adventist, entered military service in April 1942, though due to his beliefs, refused to kill or even carry a weapon and thus became a medic. Doss was wounded 4 times while rescuing between 50 and 100 men from Hacksaw Ridge on Okinawa, receiving a Medal of Honor for his actions. Yoshika Shimabukuro, a female Japanese student, was mobilized as a battlefield nurse in 1945. 70 years after Okinawa, she spoke about her experience tending to the wounded, saying, "They had legs ripped off, their intestines were falling out, faces missing. We simply had no idea what to do. I was 17. We all thought we would be back at school in a week." Of the 100,000 or so Japanese under the 32nd Army, most were killed. And while the US suffered only around 12,500 killed or missing, its casualties were up at around 82,000, with many of these being non-battle casualties such as psychological damage, injuries, and illnesses. After the Americans captured the islands of Leyte and Mindoro, they moved on to the Philippine island of Luzon. The assault was launched on the 9th of January 1945 under the codename Este, leading with a pre-landing bombardment on Japanese positions, which was answered with good old kamikaze attacks. Over the next few days, US forces landed and set up a beachhead, and on the 15th, a second landing took place, closer to the focus of the invasion, Manila. By the 11th of February, the Americans and their Filipino allies had captured Japanese outer defenses and encircled the city. They then cleared out the city, though small Japanese forces scattered throughout Luzon continued to put up resistance right up until the unconditional surrender of Japan. Japanese casualties were immense, with very few prisoners as per usual, though the atrocities inflicted on the civilian population by the Japanese were straight up evil. We won't be covering those in this video, however, as again, our focus is casualties to military units. General Walter Kruger commanded the US 6th Army, which was some 175,000 strong and supported by the 3rd and 7th Fleets. General Tomoyuki Yamashita commanded around 275,000 troops from the Imperial Japanese Army in 3 defensive groups, with the largest group, Shobo Group, numbering 152,000. The Battle of Luzon raged hardest in the streets of Manila, obliterating the city and inflicting many civilian casualties. Fighting took place between the ruins of architectural and cultural landmarks. Men killed men with flamethrowers, grenades, and bazookas. Tanks rolled over rubble and blew holes in buildings, and artillery strikes turned anything left standing into dust. It was all-out urban warfare, building to building, the worst in the Pacific War. A historian, William Manchester, wrote, "The devastation of Manila was one of the great tragedies of World War II. 70% of utilities, 75% of the factories, 80% of southern residential district, and 100% of the business district were razed." Army Sergeant Richard Foss of the 1st Cavalry Division experienced the landing on Leyte, admitting, "I don't understand how any of us survived that ordeal." Foss also spoke to a specific incident during the landing which involved one of his friends. "Just as I fell to the ground, I glanced over to look to see how Johnny Baxter was doing. I wish I had not done that. I was just in time to see blood shoot from his stomach. After he fell to the ground, blood squirted out of his buttocks like water coming out of a water faucet. The bullet that hit him went through his body. He looked over at me and said very weakly, 'Help me.'" Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi gathered the survivors of the Manila Naval Defense Force in his headquarters at the Agriculture Building in Manila during the end stages of the battle. Before he committed suicide, he apologized to the remnants of the force and told them, "If anyone has the courage to escape, please do so. If not, please take your lives here. These words were recorded in the diary of Lieutenant Hoichiro Miyazawa of the Japanese Navy. Between 192,000 to 205,000 soldiers under Yamashita's command were killed throughout the Battle of Luzon, with almost 17,000 of those deaths occurring in the Battle of Manila alone. To put it in perspective, only 9,000 or so Japanese were captured. So guys, that was the second part of this entire series and the final part of the Asian Pacific War and the casualties therein. I hope you learnt a lot out of this series, and make sure you let me know, out of all the battles we've listed in the Asia Pacific War part of things, which battle do you think was definitively the worst? Make sure you let us know in the comments section below. And just before you go guys, make sure you check out all those links in the description below, including our merchandise store where you can pick up a bunch of awesome history designs that you can show off to other history buffs or just wear for the aesthetics. So make sure you check that out. Designs will be rotating pretty much every month. So if you want to get this month's design, make sure you check out the site now. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope you learned something new.